I actually saw this vision of part of Paris and the Eiffel Tower, and I heard this phrase, fire in the streets.
There was over 1,000 buildings and 500 vehicles burned in countrywide riots, literally burned. So literally fire in the streets occurred a month after you released that prophecy. So that was, directly related.
And then even more specifically, I heard this phrase, setting fire to themselves in the process.
One of the participants, he lit his left arm on fire.
Hey y'all, this is Troy Black. I've got my brother Reese Black here with me today, and we're actually going to be going over some prophetic words that I've shared on this channel within the last year or so. So all of these words are going to be available on the Prophecy Archive, which is available on troyblackvideos.com. You can go read through the words. Reese actually helps me with that project, and he does a lot of research to gather the facts after prophecy is shared to find out what really took place, the timeline involved. And there's links to the news articles, the videos, whatever it is, to give actual evidence that the Holy Spirit is really speaking through this ministry, and that God knows what's going to happen ahead of time. So obviously the point of this kind of prophecy most of the time is simply to point to the truth of the gospel message for those that need to hear it. I believe it's also just a very good encouragement to the church that the gifts of the Spirit are for today, that God is alive and active and moving on the earth, and he's working through his body. And that God can speak to you just the same. Like, I'm not special. Nobody who hears from the Lord is an island or some sort of special person out there. But God speaks to his people because Jesus said, my sheep hear my voice. So I'm hoping that this will also be an encouragement to you with your own personal walk with the Lord. So Reese, what do you got for us?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that today we're just going to be going over some of the prophecies just in the last few years that have not been followed up on in video. Now, we followed up them on the Prophecy Archive, which obviously people can go to the website. But a lot of people, of course, just watch videos on your channel. So we're trying to hit some of the highlights for some prophecies that haven't been followed up on video or on live stream. And of course, all these prophecies, I think it's pretty incredible the way that God is using you and the way God's using this ministry. You accompany all these prophecies with biblical messages, the gospel, with prophetic teaching messages. However, today we are just hitting the highlights of predictions. We're hitting the specific words of knowledge or like timelines and predictions and that sort of things. And so we're not delving into all of the messages that were shared in these videos, but everyone, of course, is welcome to go rewatch the videos and see what the deeper spiritual message behind these prophecies were.
Awesome. All right. Well, what's the first one we're going to cover?
Let's get into this one you gave about Israel and the conflicts happening in Israel. And you shared this on September 16th, 2024. And the name of the video was God Showed Me 3 Important Dates on the Calendar.
Yeah. So I remember thinking that this one was weird. Actually, a lot of the words I hear, I remember when I hear them, I think they're weird at first. But yeah, essentially the Lord gave me what he called 3 important dates on the calendar. And those dates were, he gave me September 17th. So obviously this was about 2024. And I shared this ahead of that. But September 17th, October 18th and 19th, and then November 20th. And then he gave me this impression that, the things that were going to be happening that were critical on these dates were going to be happening. He wanted me to say on or around these dates, because some of the things are going to be a little flexible with the timeline there. But the interesting thing was the first date was the day after I posted the video. So I posted the video on September 16th, and the first day was the next day after that. The other interesting thing was these dates are in consecutive order. The 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th, they're just 3 months staggered apart. So or a month in between each one, so in 3 months in a row. So yeah, very interesting. I did not get a sense of what the critical thing was, but obviously if it was one critical topic, it was going to be the same topic connecting all of these dates together. So what did you find after the factories? So
the next day, September 17th, kicked off the fact that these were all, of course, related to events that were happening in Israel. September 17th, 2024, Israeli forces executed a deadly attack on Hezbollah with exploding pagers. So people might remember seeing the exploding pagers in the headlines. There's a huge news story. It was really shocking. Israelis had basically smuggled explosives into a package of pagers that were being sold to Hezbollah. And so they got these explosives on all of their pagers. And so they were, in people's pockets, they were on their sides and all that kind of stuff. And they detonated them all at the same time. And so there was at least 9 people killed and about 3,000 in Lebanon that were injured. And it was just one of the biggest blows that Israel and Hezbollah had traded between each other since Hezbollah had come out in support of Hamas after of course, the October 7th attacks. So this was all over the headlines, a huge strike by Israel. So that was just the day after you gave the prophecy, September 17th. On October 18th, that was the day that news broke around the world that the Hamas leader and the guy who orchestrated that October 7th attack I mentioned, he was actually killed by Israeli forces. Both Hamas and Israel confirmed his death on October 18th. Then you said October 18th and 19th. The following day, there was even more Israeli stuff coming out. The U.S. found out that there was classified documents that outlined Israel's plans of retaliation against Iran had been leaked online. So this was a big leak that went out. And then on that very same day, there was a drone attack actually on Israeli prime minister's house. And right, so that happened on the same day.
Wow.
And another dozen people were killed in Gaza by Israeli strikes on the same day. And there was also Israeli airstrikes over Beirut, and then also another series of barrages into Israel from Lebanon. And so that was just like 4 or 5 things that all happened on the same day, right after the Hamas leader had been killed. You had the big secret information leak online, and then you had all these strikes, including one that was actually on the Israeli prime minister's house.
Yeah, I remember that week being kind of crazy with the Israel news. Yeah,
those were 2 days that you said again together, October 18th and 19th, kind of as one 2-day couple. And then the last date that you gave was November 20th. And so November 20th, 2024, that was the day that the U.S. vetoed a Gaza ceasefire resolution by the United Nations Security Council. And so I remember this in the headlines. The U.S. was getting a lot of heat for this because the United Nations was trying to create a ceasefire between Israel and Gaza. The U.S.'s ambassador to the UN actually vetoed that ceasefire. And the reason given was because the ceasefire did not closely enough link the release of hostages. And so the UN ambassador, the US ambassador said that, no, this isn't a good ceasefire because it's not directly linked to all these hostages being released. And so all these 3 dates or couples of dates linked heavily to the conflict happening in Israel at this time.
I think the main question people would ask with that one is after the fact would be, well, why didn't God tell you it was about Israel? You know, and I think there's just that's something I've learned is like sometimes the Holy Spirit will give you a certain amount of information and that's it. Other times I think it falls on the sort of the weakness of the vessel involved, you know, because the word says prophesy in accordance in proportion with your faith, you know, and I think there is when you're listening to the voice of the Lord, there's a couple things happening. One is, what would you be willing to hear God say, you know, specifically? And that is like, what faith do you have for God to speak about certain things? And then the second thing is, how long did you sit there and wait for him to speak? You know, so it could be possibly like if I had spent more time waiting upon the Lord about that word, it could have been that I did hear something else, you know? So there's always like, you know, that communication and that like relationship aspect involved where it's like the more time you spend with somebody, the more you learn about that person or the more they're able to communicate with you. So there, you know, it's like that is the way prophecy works, you know, sometimes, but I believe generally speaking, it's pretty obvious that God was, you know, speaking about Israel and that the word was fulfilled. So.
All right, getting to the next prophecy. This one had a very specific timeline on it as well. The name of this video is God Showed Me What's Coming in 1 Week. And you released this pretty recently. This was on January 31st, 2025, so at the beginning of this year. And this is a word that you released that had to do with rats being exposed in the government. So you want to give a highlight of this prophetic word?
Yeah, there's kind of a lot to it, but I'll try to go through it quickly. So I heard a phrase, there's a rat underneath the sink right now and in the toilets. And I got this picture that was like the house was like the government house essentially. And it was representing like the government itself as if the government were a house and there were rats involved, kind of metaphor. But then I heard making changes behind closed doors, behind the scenery, but he's about to get caught. And then I got this image of a rat getting caught in a trap while I was sharing that. And I actually shared a story in that video of a real story from my life where me and Leslie, my wife, were early married and we were living in some really old apartments and there were lots of holes and these big old rats would get in. We had a really bad rat problem. And so one night I stayed up all night long and killed 5 rats by resetting the traps and then going to bed and waiting and then hearing them snap and then going back out. So I shared that story of actually catching 5 rats in one night. which I did not in the moment didn't realize that there might be something prophetic to that, but obviously I feel like there was based on the results. But then I heard there's going to be a concerted effort similar to that is going to happen swiftly and quickly, and people are going to see it. So obviously something happening quickly. And then I heard the Holy Spirit say, I'm putting an 8-day timeline on this. Within 8 days, people are going to see some of these things happening and some of these things coming out in the news. And then I heard an uncovering, a general, a major undertaking, a major deal. He's getting uncovered at this moment. Got an impression it would surface that next week. And then I heard there's a rat in hiding. She's getting uncovered, and a restitution will be paid back to those she took advantage of. And the impression I got about the pronoun she was that it's representing not just a person or an individual, but rather a movement that these individuals are connected to.
All right, let's get into the results. So you, like you said, you had a week timeline or an 8-day timeline on this one. So this one was kind of interesting. Again, you shared this at the end of January 31st. And so this was a little bit over. So some of these things actually occurred during that timeline. However, the news cycle, they pretty much all came out on like the Monday after that timeline was over, like a couple of days after the 8-day timeline. And so we'll get into like the time they occurred and the time the news cycle came out. So it was a little over a week later, President Donald Trump fired 5 critical employees from FEMA and USAID, and he fired them all on February 11th, 2025. So just a little bit over a week's timeline from the date that you shared. In his campaign to cut waste and corruption in government spending. So we'll get into those specifics and how they hit some of the things that you said, but it was interesting because, again, I thought it was crazy. You gave the story about catching 5 rats in one night, and then it was like, whoa, this was actually 5 individuals who were all fired as, you know, Trump and the Doge was coming out on X and Twitter and saying was like fired for essentially corruption or going against Donald Trump's campaign or the things that he's trying to do. And so at the end of that 8-day timeline, one of these individuals, what they did, it was the FEMA chief financial officer, Mary Coleman's. She used $59 million that was meant for disaster relief for U.S. citizens, and she used that money to pay for luxury hotels in New York City to house illegal migrants. And that was, she sent that money and did that payment towards the end of your timeline. It was like literally day like 7 or day 8. I have to go back and look at what the specific days, but it was right at the end of that timeline that was found out essentially by Doge, who then reported it the following Monday, because that was like end of the week. So then the following Monday on February 10th, Elon Musk exposed this FEMA payment from the week before on social media. And then they fired her, and they also fired 3 other FEMA employees that were involved in authorizing this payment. From the DHS statement, FEMA is terminating the employment of 4 individuals for circumventing leadership to unilaterally make egregious payments for luxury NYC hotels for migrants. Under President Trump and Secretary Noam's leadership, DHS will not sit idly and allow deep state activists to undermine the will and safety of the American people. That statement kind of just hit on what you were talking about with like kind of like the rats, and then getting caught and cleared out. The last individual who got fired also on the same exact day was actually an inspector general for the U.S. Agency for International Development. I thought that was interesting because you did quickly say general. You said general.
And uncovering a general, a major undertaking, a major deal. He's getting uncovered right at this moment.
Yeah. And then you also specifically highlighted at the end, there's a rat in hiding. You used the she language, and the she language specifically connected to the chief financial officer of FEMA. And now we have the general here, who's an inspector general for USAID. It was the day before, February 10th, he issued a report criticizing Trump for gutting USAID. So he was just criticizing him. Of course, you know, Trump and Doge would say they were trying to cut corruption and cut waste and all that kind of stuff. People that were in support of what USAID was doing, you know, they would say otherwise. But that was his take. He released a scathing report, trying to criticize Donald Trump and the things they were doing. And then he was fired the next day. And so he ended up being the 5th of these employees that were fired on the same day that were kind of linked to that Trump and Doge campaign to cut government waste and then kind of a little bit corruption there as well. So that was an interesting fulfillment for this one.
I just love how like I feel like the Lord put that story of like the 5 rats in my head, like while I was like, you know, like reminded me of that, like while I was sharing it, and then it like connected so well.
All right, our next prophecy is actually from a couple years back. This was a prophecy released about France. He released this on May 24th, 2023, in a video titled, "This is Coming, a Strange Vision from God of Future Events in France." And so you actually give a very lengthy prophetic word. I'll stop here to say that, again, we're kind of hitting the highlights, especially on these ones that are longer. And so there's going to be a link below where people can go and see these specific it's just going to be listed these specific prophecies that we're covering right now. So you can read the full prophecy as well as the full details of fulfillment and all of the articles that are linked as well. We're not going to pull up all the articles and show all the proof at this moment. We're kind of just hitting the summaries and the highlights, but that's going to be available for you if you want to pull up and see everything. So Troy, can you give us a summary of this rather lengthy and detailed picture of the things that be occurring in France? One of which has a timeline. Most of them didn't have a timeline, but there's one specific element to this that had a timeline. And then I'll try to give, as best I can, a summary of the many results that came out specifically to this prophecy.
So I actually saw this vision of a globe, and it had Christmas trees, snow, and like a wooded scene. And inside the globe, I saw part of Paris and the Eiffel Tower. And then I saw the Eiffel Tower falling over. And I remember sharing that I didn't believe that the Lord was saying it was going to specifically fall over, but rather that was a metaphor for structures, symbolic for some sort of probably government structure or societal structure, something in France, toppling. Then I heard the glass house is shattering, the tower is toppling, the tall abrasion is tumbling. An abrasion is something that like sticks out, that's kind of ugly. And so I believe that was probably talking about something tumbling in the government structure that, has been, or society that's been like kind of abrasive for a while. But I shared how I felt like there was going to be a sign of something taking place in the physical as well. Then I heard this word specifically: by this Christmas, France will be in an uproar over a new strategy planned by their government. And then obviously that had to do with the Christmas stuff. And then I heard it has to do with controlling the will of the people in the digital age. So that made it a little more specific, controlling the will of the people in the digital age. And I got an impression it would be related to shadow banning, which is obviously something that happens when people are trying to post their opinions online, and, the social media networks push back and don't allow them to, or suppress their voice. And then I got this idea that it would be related to the idea of ignoring the truth and ignoring what people want. So essentially probably the government or whoever's in control ignoring that. And I heard this phrase, fire in the streets. Then I heard the phrase, it's going to be worse than that, talking about the things that were already happening. So we were already seeing by that point when I shared this, some riots in France, already seen some uproar. And I heard the Lord say it was going to be worse, and it was going to be a time of great shaking and catastrophe.
Yeah, so you did have a specific detail about the possible digital censorship that was going to occur, and with a timeline on that one, very specifically Christmas. And so we'll get into that in a second. But the very end of that prophecy, like you said, fire in the streets. And you even said it in the video that you knew that there was these riots that were happening. So at the time, actually, when you released this video on May 24th, 2023, there was these massive France riots that were, or protests. There were more protests. There were protests that were occurring over pension reform that the president was trying to do, the French president, Macron, nationwide protests. And when you released this, and so it was really interesting that you said that this was going to be worse than that. There was fire in the streets. You saw fire in the streets, and you heard fire in the streets, and this was going to be worse. So a month later, those protests were done. By the time you shared this word, they were pretty much had fizzled out, and that was over. Literally the next month after you shared this, much worse protests and riots broke out. So this was on June 27th, 2023. What happened was police killed a teenager who was of North African descent, and it sparked massive riots from the migrant community there in France. And there was over 1,000 buildings and 500 vehicles burned in countrywide riots, literally burned. So literally fire in the streets, buildings, thousands of buildings, hundreds of cars being burnt. And so that occurred a month after you released that prophecy. So that was, directly related to that one. One quick little detail was during the protests and during the burning and stuff, there was a press release, a government press release that was widely shared online. And it was talking about how France was going to restrict internet access to certain areas to try to stamp down unrest. Right. And so that was this press release was, and then, so this actually enraged rioters even more.
Yeah.
However, it has all been proven that that was actually a false press release, that did not actually come from the government. Like, that was, from everything I could find, it seemed pretty reputable that that was in fact completely false. But it was shared by everybody saying, oh, wow, the government is going to cut internet access because people kept sharing videos of the riots. And, the thought was like, well, it was going to cause more people to riot. That only made the situation worse.
Yeah.
Although France has said that that was false and that wasn't something that was actually released by them. However, President Macron did definitely come out during that time and highly accused social media companies for playing what he called a considerable role in the unrest, for not censoring. But I think the real fulfillment of that one, or a stronger fulfillment, really occurred a little closer to Christmas. And this was actually on October 17th, again, that same year, 2023. And France passed a digital regulation law titled SREN. And the French digital minister promised that this new law was going to protect citizens, children, and businesses. However, basically, any proponent or advocate of free speech called it a shameful text and said that it was criminalizing online behavior and removing online anonymity. Is that how you say that word? Anonymous? It's like making it where you can no longer be anonymous online. And so essentially this was just another law that we've seen people coming out, especially in Europe. This is a big thing where people are trying to make what you say online illegal if you express certain opinions, and also not be able to hide behind an anonymous profile. You have to have like a government, ID essentially linked to your. And so there was a law in that vein trying to push that sort of thing. So that came out right before Christmas, just a couple months before Christmas. The very last final, I would say, like result or that connected to this prophetic word, only that one specific piece had the by Christmas timeline, I would say, like the digital piece. But you had that image of the Eiffel Tower falling over. And I just thought it was interesting because all of this that occurred that year was a really tumultuous year. 2023, was a very tumultuous year for France and was hard, of course, on the French president. And so after a tumultuous 2 years for France, headlines across the world read, French government collapses. And this came out on December 4th, 2024. So that was kind of interesting, right before Christmas the following year, because what occurred was President Macron had appointed a brand new prime minister who runs like the domestic affairs. And he was ousted after just being in office for 3 months. And so 3 months he was ousted. And because there were some snap elections that happened in the summer, would essentially put Macron and his leading party in a position where they no longer had a majority in the parliament. And so in Europe, it's a little more common for this to occur. The US has a very different political system. But that was what all the headlines said, was like the government has collapsed because there was no more ruling party and their prime minister was booted after only being in office for 3 months. And so that was all over the headlines. France's government has collapsed. And so that was like the last fulfillment, I'd say, of like the Eiffel Tower falling down and the restructuring, reorganizing kind of piece.
That's really good, man. That's really comprehensive. I'm so glad that you're working so hard on these archive entries, because I obviously would not have the time, to do it, but also
it's a lot to cover. I mean, that's a lot. I mean, and you release a lot of prophetic words, and so it takes time to dig into like what's what's occurring, and once you start digging into it, it's crazy the connections that you can find of just like, oh wow, you said this, and then this thing, the headlines, speak for themselves oftentimes. So it's interesting. All right, this one is a prophecy you released that had a very visual, shocking result to it. The title of the video was, "This is Serious, God Showing Me Coming Riots." And this was released on September 11th, 2024. You streamed it on that day, 9/11, 2024.
Yeah, so one of the things I heard the Lord say, I see rioters protesting at the Capitol. And then I heard angry, they didn't get their way. Then I heard this phrase, a mass, as in like the masses, a mass disruption. And then I heard this phrase, get in the car and get out of there. And then I heard this, a public stunt is going to go wrong. And then right after that, I started seeing visions of rioters in the streets. Then I heard this, which I think gets a little more specific, the phrase, a misguided youth surges, a false dichotomy, discontentment with reality, sending people into a rage, a fury. raging about things they cannot change. Then the phrase, this will start a public discourse about what is a healthy way to respond to things like this and what is not, what is appropriate. The response itself will shake many up and cause them to look at their own way of dealing with the present reality, their own view of the situation. And then even more specifically, I heard this phrase, setting fire to themselves in the process. So obviously I talked about how that could be a metaphor. I wasn't really sure what that meant, that phrase, setting fire to themselves in the process. But also I said it could be a metaphor, but could be a physical thing as well.
So we had a very specific fulfillment from this. So let's see, again, you released this on 9/11, 2024. The next month, there was a pro-Palestinian protest happening in the nation's capital in Washington, D.C. And this was on October 5th, 2024. And so this was obviously marking the 1-year anniversary of the October 7th attack that Hamas did on Israel. But of course, they're protesting in support of Palestine. At that time, when they got to the White House area, one of the participants, who's a photojournalist, he lit his left arm on fire in front of the White House. And there are videos of his arm burning, were posted on social media, posted on X. And police put out the flames and transported Mina to a hospital. The Saturday protest was one of many that took place around the U.S. Capitol from October 5th through the 7th. So there's a lot of protests that happened around the Capitol during that time. And so that kind of connects to some of the things, as far as like I think there's been a lot of dialogue recently. I think of the Just Stop Oil people and stuff like that, as far as what's the appropriate way to protest, and then what's a way that just makes yourself look silly or dumb or doing something really unsafe, in public. And so I think it was one of those things that probably garnered up a little bit of criticism as far as people protesting about something that, like you said, is these protests that they're doing in Washington, D.C., can they really change this thing that's happening on the other side of the world? Not saying we shouldn't express our free speech, but is this the way, specifically this guy lighting himself on fire, is this the way to, bring attention to these kinds of things? What result happened from him lighting himself on fire? That was just kind of the thoughts I was having when I read your prophecy, and some of those lines about something that they can't change, and then people kind of questioning about the ways in which they should be expressing these sorts of things. Oh, and even that line that you said, a public stunt gone wrong. I mean, it was a public stunt, and in a way, I would consider it to be gone wrong. Except, I guess it was the kind of how it depends on how you look at that. But the line you said, "Get in the car and get out of here." Get out of there. I mean, that was probably specifically said to this guy because the police came, put it out, and then immediately threw him in an ambulance and drove him to a hospital. So that was something that actually happened as well. Of course, the literal setting themselves on fire at the U.S. Capitol in front of the White House, of all things. The last prophecy reviewing is a video you released called "God Showed Me a Coming Fire" by July. And so you're specifically talking about July, and you released this on May 16th, 2024. And we all know about some of the crazy things that happened in July of 2024.
Yeah, so the word itself was pretty short, and obviously I'm pretty sure it connects in two different directions. One being more of a cultural thing that was happening, and one being more of a sign that was happening in the earth. I heard the Lord say Tucson, Arizona. It's so funny because typically I'll hear, we were laughing about it a few minutes ago, but when I shared the word, I think I said Tucson, Arizona, because I didn't know how to pronounce it. And there have been times where the Holy Spirit will say something to me, and maybe I'll hear it, and then other times I'll see the word, and so I'll write down what I'm seeing, and I don't know how to pronounce it, and so anyway, so I think in the original video I kept saying Tucson, Arizona, and people had to correct me, but I heard Tucson, Arizona, fire in the hole, a massive slice of living, a fire starter by this July. And then I heard this phrase, a pacifist will be fighting for survival. So it seemed like maybe a little disconnected there. And then I heard, get ready for a changing of seasons, an altering of destinies from top to bottom, from bottom up. So pretty strange wording, like either metaphorical or parabolic or something, but definitely symbolic in some way.
Yeah, except for the line saying by this July and Tucson, Arizona. So there's definitely, you're pointing to something happening in Tucson, Arizona by July.
And a fire starter. The word
but
fire
the rest
starter.
of it for sure, it's sort of like, okay, what is this about? What's going to be occurring? But I wanted to review this one because it was grounded with that timeline, that specific place and the specific timeline. And so getting into the results of it you released this on May 16th, 2024. On July 11th, 2024, middle of July, just north of Tucson, Arizona, the Freeman Fire started. by 2 lightning strikes. And the fire burned over 32,000 acres and required crews from Tucson to battle it. So not just the people north, but the actual crews from Tucson was going, and that's how close it was to Tucson. The firefighter crews were going and putting out the fires. And the fire was finally contained on July 18th, 2024. So it burned for about a week. And again, 32,000 acres was a massive fire right outside of Tucson, occurred in the middle of July. And so that was the specific word of knowledge, easy fulfillment of, you said fire starter, Tucson, Arizona, July. I was looking at it and I just thought it was really interesting. And other people might have a different interpretation, but this is my interpretation of a pacifist will be fighting for survival. And then a little bit of that getting ready for changing of seasons, altering of destinies. So I just thought it was culturally, politically, timeline was interesting. When that was occurring, the fire was going on, there was some significant developments concerning President Donald Trump. And so the fire actually started 2 days before Trump was shot through the ear in that assassination attempt that occurred on July 13th. And then the fire burned through the entirety of the Republican National Convention. That was the next week, which is when the Republican Party officially nominated President Trump as the candidate for presidency. And the fire was finally contained on the last day of the RNC on July 18th. That was the day the fire was contained. And that was the day that Trump delivered his official acceptance speech. And so that was kind of an interesting thing that was occurring there. And then as far as the whole, like a pacifist, it's kind of funny. Like, obviously I'm interpreting this, that the pacifist fighting for survival was actually Donald Trump. It's kind of funny referring to Donald Trump as a pacifist because he's kind of like a belligerent figure in a lot of ways,
sort
and
of
offensive.
Yeah.
And he's offensive to a lot of people. However, in a lot of ways, I think that he is on a global stage actually a pacifist. The next day, actually July 19th, he had a phone call with President Zelensky. That was like a friendly conversation that they had. And the whole time during his election season, he was touting how he was going to end the war with Russia and Ukraine. And we still have him attempting to do that and attempting to push for a mineral deal between the U.S. and Ukraine to try to help end the war. And that's just one of the things that he basically ran on. His platform has been in direct opposition to what a lot of people refer to as like the war hawks, either on the right or the left, people that are usually in favor of like getting America involved overseas with many wars as possible, or just a lot of American interventionism. And he's just opposite of that. He's very opposite. He's very America focused and kind of anti-war, and said how he wants to try to stop all these global conflicts and all that kind of stuff. So that was my take on it. A little bit of metaphorical language. A pacifist would be fighting for survival, but it just was interesting during that time. Literally was fighting for survival, and there was that. A lot of people would consider that to be like the change in the election that kind of definitely led to Donald Trump being elected. So
no, I think that's a very interesting connection. It's definitely seems likely. Well, thanks, man. Thanks for sharing all this information and doing all this awesome research. So if y'all have not checked out the prophecy archive on troyblackvideos.com, Reese has put together, I think it's like we've got over 80 fulfilled prophecies on there now with the details, the research, all of that available. You can go read through it on your own time. There's a prophecy highlight page that has the sort of the top 10, what we would consider the 10 most significant ones on there, or most interesting. But then there's a bunch of them on there, and some of them get really detailed, but anyways, so yeah, we did our best to provide the information, and obviously you can go on there, read the results, make up your mind for yourself. Reese, thanks again for putting this together.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Exciting. I love reviewing prophecy. I love getting to review, the headlines and anything that's directly connected to prophecies that you've released. It's always really cool to see how the Holy Spirit is confirming the words that he's releasing on this channel. So
awesome. All right. Love y'all so much, and I'll see you next time.